Close your eyes and allow your thoughts to drift far from the present moment, far from the noise and motion of the world. Imagine yourself standing in the stillness of an ancient land, where the air is thick with the scent of warm sand and sacred oils, where the Nile weaves like a serpent through golden fields, and where the sky above burns not with heat, but with memory. The wind carries whispers soft, rhythmic, like the echo of voices lost to time. Here, in the land the ancients called Kemet, the horizon is not just a place where the sun sets. It is where the soul begins its greatest journey. You are standing at the edge of two worlds. Before you lies a body, recently departed, cloaked in linen, still and silent. Around it, the family gathers, not just in grief, but in purpose. There is no rush, no panic, only ritual, only reverence. Because, in this world, death is not the end. It is merely the beginning of a far longer, far more mysterious journey. To the ancient Egyptians, death was not a moment of vanishing, but a moment of passage, a transformation, a doorway to the next realm. This belief was not rooted in fear, but in structure, in cosmic law. The world beyond was not an abstraction, it was a place as real as Thebes or Memphis, and it had its own rules, its own geography, and its own gods. The dead were not lost. They were expected, but to arrive safely, they needed guidance, protection, preparation. They needed ritual. From the very moment breath left the body, a sacred process unfolded. Funerary rituals were not random, nor were they simply expressions of sorrow. They were carefully orchestrated ceremonies, encoded with symbolism, empowered by spells, and rooted in generations of divine instruction. These were not just acts of tradition. They were acts of survival for the soul. The Egyptians believed that a person was composed of many spiritual parts, each of which had a unique role in life and after death. The Ka, the life force, needed nourishment. It lived on offerings and ritual sustenance. The Ba, the soul with wings, could move between worlds, but needed to return to the body each night to rest. The Ok, the immortal light body, only formed after a successful journey through judgment and divine transformation. Then there was the Ren, the name, which preserved identity, and the Shwt, the shadow, silent but always present. Death did not simply separate the spirit from the body, it fragmented the self, and the rituals were there to put it all back together. As the sun dipped low over the desert, a priest would be summoned, not just any priest, but one trained in the rituals of the House of Life. He might arrive wearing a mask of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming and guardian of tombs. His presence marked the transition from grief to sacred duty. Every action from this point forward was charged with divine meaning. The body would be washed, not only to cleanse, but to purify. Special waters drawn from the Nile would be used, perhaps infused with natron or lotus. The act was slow, deliberate, rhythmic. As the water flowed, so did prayers, hymns to Osiris, the god who had himself died and returned. The body, now clean, was anointed with sacred oils. Myrrh, frankincense, cedarol, symbolic, all functional. These oils helped preserve the flesh. Yes, but they also awakened the senses. The ancient belief held that for the soul to recognize and re-inhabit the body, it had to perceive. So the nostrils were opened with oils to invite scent, The eyelids were touched so the deceased could see. The ears were rubbed so they could hear the prayers. The mouth was left untouched, reserved for the most vital rite of all, the opening of the mouth. Before this rite, the body was dressed in linen wrappings, each layer carefully inscribed with protective spells from the Book of the Dead. Amulets were tucked between folds, the Eye of Horus to heal, the scarab to protect the heart, the ankh to symbolize eternal life. Priests moved like dancers around the body. Every motion was part of a larger choreographed bun, designed not to mourn, but to awaken. When all was ready, the priest stepped forward with the ritual tool. It might be shaped like a fish spine or a miniature. He stood at the head of the body and recited incantations in a steady, solemn voice. Then, slowly, he touched the tool to the lips, the eyes, the ears, the orifices of perception. These gestures were more than symbols. They were magic. They restored function. The soul, now hovering, confused, fragmented, might feel the stirrings of awareness. Sight, smell, hearing, these were the senses that would allow it to navigate the underworld. Without them, the journey was impossible, but the body's preparation was only half the battle. The soul required more than a functioning vessel. It required memory, identity, connection. For this, the living played a vital role. The family gathered to recite the name of the deceased. Over and over, they whispered it, wrote it, carved it into stone. The render name was not just a label, it was the very essence of the person. As long as the name was spoken, the person lived. Should it be forgotten, erased, silenced, the soul would dissolve into nothingness. Offerings were made, to bread, beer, fruit, incense, and water. These were not simply acts of respect. The ka, the life force, depended on them. Every loaf placed at the tomb, every cup of beer poured in ritual, fed the spirit. Without offerings, the ka would wither, the soul would weaken, and eventually fail. The tomb itself was more than a burial site. It was a carefully constructed universe. Inside its walls, scenes from the deceased's life were painted in vibrant color. These were not mere decorations. They were magical images designed to come alive in the afterlife. One wall might show a garden, full of trees heavy with fruit. Another might show servants bringing wine, or music being played. These images were meant to manifest in the next world, ensuring the dead would not wander hungry or alone. The sarcophagus, often carved from stone or crafted from wood and covered in gold leaf, was inscribed with protective spells. The outer walls of the tomb bore curses not for the soul, but for those who would dare disturb it. Tomb robbers were a constant threat, and spiritual traps were laid with just as much precision as physical ones. As the funeral procession made its way through the desert, the family followed behind, singing laments, some genuine, others written. 2 women, often hired mourners, would wail as Isis and Nephthys once did. Their cries were not just expressions of grief, they were reenactments of a divine story. By mirroring the mourning of goddesses, the family placed the deceased in the same cosmic narrative as Osiris. In doing so, they invoked protection and rebirth. Upon reaching the tomb, the final rites were performed. The opening of the mouth was reenacted at the tomb's entrance, ensuring the deceased could speak to the gods. Final offerings were placed, prayers were recited, and then, slowly, the tomb was sealed. But that was not the end. The soul now stood before a long and dangerous journey. It would travel through Duat, the Egyptian underworld, a realm of shadows, monsters, gods, and tests. In this world, knowledge was power. The Book of the Dead, sometimes written on papyrus scrolls and buried with the deceased, served as a guidebook. It contained spells, passwords, hymns, and instructions. The soul had to know the names of the gatekeepers. It had to recite the correct phrases to pass through trials. It had to stand before Osiris in the Hall of Two Truths and declare its purity. There, the heart was weighed against the feather of Mat. If the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, the soul was devoured by a meter demon, part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile. But if it was light, the soul became an transfigured luminous, free to dwell in the field of reeds. A paradise where one could plough fields forever under the warm sun, reunite with loved ones, and bask in divine favor. For the living, the rituals didn't stop with burial. Feasts were held at the tomb during festivals like the beautiful Feast of the Valley. Families would eat and drink beside their ancestors, speaking to them, honoring them, keeping their names alive. Tombs were visited, cleaned, repaired. The relationship between the living and the dead continued not out of fear, but out of love, out of memory. And so, as you stand in the quiet desert dusk, with the last rays of sunlight turning the sands to fire, you begin to understand what the ancient Egyptians believed about death. It was not silence. It was not absence. It was transition. It was continuity. The soul, if cared for, if remembered, would live and not just in the field of reeds, but here, in every whispered name, in every bread offering, in every flicker of candlelight at a tomb's edge. The wind shifts again. Somewhere, the bar flies low over the Nile, circling back toward home. The drinks from the offering bowl. The ock glows just beyond the veil, and a grandchild speaks the wren softly before sleep. The desert wind blew low and solemn, dragging with it the dust of memory, in a land where the eternal sun never ceased to rise. Even death unfolded beneath its gaze with ceremony, rhythm, and reverence. The embalmer's tent stood in shadow now, still and silent, its work complete. The body, once of flesh and breath, had been transformed into a vessel of anointed, swathed in linen, and protected by spells whispered through generations. Now, another phase of the journey would begin, one no less sacred than the rites of preservation. This was the funeral procession, a movement of souls, of people, of divine echoes through the living world, toward the stillness of death's domain. In ancient Egypt, a funeral was never a moment of privacy tucked into the corner of life. It was a spectacle, a declaration, a final chapter read aloud for all to hear, and especially for those of means, wealth, or prestige. This journey to the tomb became a dramatic performance of grief, legacy, myth, and cosmic transition. What modern eyes might view as mourning, the ancient Egyptians understood as participation in a divine story, one that stretched beyond the individual and into the architecture of the cosmos itself. At the center of it all lay the body, no longer just a corpse, but a symbol. It rested on a bier, often fashioned of wood and adorned with gold leaf, symbols, or protective imagery. This bier was mounted on a sledge or cart and drawn by oxen. Their slow, rhythmic steps kicked up sand in hypnotic puffs as they pulled the sacred burden forward. It was no mere transportation, it was ritual movement, each step a beat in the rhythm of transcendence. Around this central figure, the procession began to take form. Priests led the way, dressed in immaculate white linen, their shaven heads gleaming in the sun. One might carry incense, its curling smoke weaving through the air like invisible prayers. Another recited hymns or spells from the Book of the Dead, the sacred text that served as both roadmap and protection for the soul's passage through the underworld. The sound of chanting mixed with the metallic jangle of Sistram's musical instruments, sacred to the goddess, Hathor created a tapestry of sound that wove the mundane with the divine. Behind them walked the family, dressed in mourning, but not all in silence. The most dramatic elements of this scene were the professional mourner's orphan, two women selected or hired specifically to represent the divine sisters Isis and Nephthys. These were not mere actresses. They performed a sacred role. They embodied the two mourning goddesses who wept for Osiris, the murdered king, the archetype of all who die and are reborn, with hair unbound and garments torn. These women wailed and beat their breasts, their cries rising in tandem with the voices of the priests. Their lamentations were rhythmic, stylized, and ritualized, reenacting the primal grief of divine loss. To mourn for the deceased was to mourn for Osiris, and by invoking the myth, by echoing the cries of the goddesses, they helped to weave the dead into the fabric of the eternal myth. They were not just mourning, they were binding the soul to the divine cycle of death and resurrection. Dancers joined the mourners, their movements sharp and spiraling, choreographed expressions of sorrow and tribute. Their steps told stories. A slow turn represented the passage of time. A sudden fall to the ground echoed the descent into death. And just as often, musicians followed, playing lyres, harps, and flutes. This was no somber silence, it was an orchestrated symphony of reverence and remembrance. The dead were not feared. They were honored, celebrated, transformed into legends as the procession wound through the dusty streets and toward the Nile. For the rich and noble, entire communities might turn out to observe the passing. Onlookers wept, not necessarily out of personal loss, but because the moment demanded it. The death of a great figure was a disruption in the world. As Balancer tear in the veil. To weep publicly was to participate in the healing of that tear, and perhaps to earn favor when their own time came. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the sand, the procession approached the river Nile, the great river giver of life, bearer of myths, mirror of the sky, was not merely a barrier of water. It was the line between worlds. The east bank, where the sun rose, was the land of the living. The west bank, where the sun set, was the land of the dead. To cross it was to move not only through space, but through existence itself. Waiting at the shore was a boat, specially prepared and decorated, with its own set of rituals and symbols. The body, accompanied by the priests, the mourners, the family, and perhaps even statues of gods, was placed on board. As the vessel set off across the glittering water, the chants continued. The rhythmic splash of the oars became part of the ritual, each pull a step toward eternity. This crossing was no mere journey, it was the sacred reenactment of the solar bark of Ra, the sun god, who traveled through the heavens by day and the underworld by night. To sail across the Nile was to echo Ra's eternal journey, to position the deceased not as lost, but as ascending, journeying, becoming. The priest may have raised his arms to the sun, reciting hymns from the pyramid texts. These were not words of mourning, they were words of transformation. Spells to lift the spirit from shadow into light. Once across the river, the procession resumed. But the mood was shifting. The grief, though still present, had begun to transform into purpose. The destination was near, and with it, the culmination of weeks, sometimes months, of preparation. The tomb waited, carved into stone or built of mud brick, adorned with offerings and flanked by guardians of both stone and spirit. But before the tomb could be reached, one final performance was needed. At the head of the procession, a statue or image of the deceased may have been carried. This was no mere likeness. It was an anchor for the soul, a reminder of identity. Alongside it, a figure might walk with a mask of Anubis, jackal god of embalming and protector of the dead, guiding the way like a divine usher. The two mourning women now increased their wailing, calling upon Isis and Nephthys in full force, their arms raised to the heavens. Their cries reached a fever pitch. The air pulsed with sound, with purpose, with the tension of the veil between life and death being drawn back. The body was placed before the tomb, and there, at the threshold of the eternal house, the most sacred ritual of all was performed, the opening of the mouth. This ceremony was the climax of the journey. The priest, often playing the role of the eldest son or divine intermediary, took the ritual adze or ceremonial blade and touched it to the lips of the deceased. This act symbolically restored the senses, speech, sight, breath, allowing the soul to communicate in the next world, to speak to the gods, to defend itself in the weighing of the heart. Chants echoed across the valley. Spells were recited, not in desperation, but in triumph. For the ancient Egyptians, this was not an end. It was a coronation, a rebirth, a homecoming. The deceased was no longer just a body. He or she had become Osiris, the archetypal soul of the afterlife, and through ritual, they too had conquered death. The mourners wept, the priests chanted, the family held hands, the final offerings, food, drink, incense, were laid before the tomb, and then the tomb was sealed, not in sorrow, but in solemnity. Its walls would hold the stories, the symbols, the memories. Its chambers would echo with silence and spells, and within it the body would wait not for resurrection, but for continuation, for judgment, for eternity. Even after the tomb was sealed, the procession itself was remembered. Stories would be told of the grandeur, the devotion, the spectacle. Songs might be composed. Family members would reflect, and the images painted inside the tomb would preserve the memory of this journey for all time. The funeral procession, then, was more than a goodbye. It was a living thread in a vast cosmic web. It tied the deceased to the gods, the family to the eternal, and the land of the living to the land of the dead. Every step, every sound, every tear was an offering not to loss, but to legacy. And as the wind swept across the west bank, and the sun dipped behind the hills of the necropolis, the procession finally dissolved, leaving behind not emptiness, but echo. The echo of faith, the echo of eternity. In the land where the golden sun rose each morning over the Nile, and where life danced to the rhythm of the seasons, there existed a ritual that defied time. It was a sacred choreography of science, belief, and magic. one that promised eternity to those who dared to prepare for it. This was the art of mummification, a rite so vital that even the gods watched in solemn reverence as the living tended to the dead. The Egyptians did not fear death, as we might imagine. To them, death was merely the threshold, a passage to another world, not an end, but a transformation. And for that transformation to occur successfully, one truth remained unshaken across centuries of dynasties and deserts. The body must be preserved. It had to remain intact, whole, undisturbed, for the soul, which fractured into multiple parts at death, would someday seek its vessel again. And so, as soon as the final breath was drawn and the stillness settled upon the chest of the departed, a new ritual began, one that would carry the deceased across the great unknown. The sacred process of mummification was not merely physical preservation. It was a spell cast in layers of linen and oil, in salt and scent, in silence and whispered ink. The body, now lifeless, was transported in a ceremonial cart or carried by veiled attendants to a secluded structure near the riverbank, a place often referred to as the Ibu, or place of purification. These temporary tent-like structures stood between life and death, canvas walls fluttering in the desert wind, hiding within them the most sacred acts of preparation. Here, the body would first be ritually cleansed with Nile water, sometimes infused with palm wine or incense. The priests who undertook this task were not merely undertakers. They were living conduits of divine will, dressed in clean white linen, heads shaved in purity. They spoke the names of gods under their breath as they worked. Every gesture was deliberate, every movement a reenactment of cosmic mythology. Once washed, the body would be dried. And here began one of the most important steps: the application of neat, a naturally occurring salt mixture found in dry lake beds across Egypt. This natron had remarkable desiccating properties, capable of drawing out all moisture from flesh and bone. The body would be covered in it entirely, inside and out. In some cases, it was poured into the abdominal cavity and packed into the mouth and nose. It would remain buried in natron for up to 40 days. 40 days, not a number chosen at random, but one imbued with significance. It was the length of time the body was believed to require for complete spiritual and physical transition. During this waiting period, while the body slowly dried into a preserved vessel, the priests recited prayers from the Book of the Dead or from older pyramid texts and coffin texts, depending on the era and wealth of the deceased. These were not just recitations, they were protective spells designed to shield the soul in its journey through the Duat. The Egyptian underworld, when the body was removed from the natron, it had lost much of its weight. The skin clung tightly to bone, and the once supple features of the face had hollowed into a visage both serene and skeletal. Now the anointing began. The priests would coat the body with oils: cedar oil, frankincense, myrrh, mixed sometimes with resins that would seal the skin. These oils were more than aromatic. They had antibacterial properties and were seen as gifts from the gods. The most sacred oil, known as the oil of the gods, was reserved for royalty and high priests. It was used sparingly but purposefully, touched only by the most senior of. Then came the of. Depending on the period and regional custom, the internal organs were removed. carefully and with ritual significance. The stomach, liver, lungs, and intestines were each extracted and treated individually with natron, then wrapped in linen. They were placed into canopic jars, each guarded by one of the four sons of Horus: Imseti, the human-headed protector of the liver; Hopi, the baboon-headed guardian of the lungs; Duamutef, the jackal-headed deity watching over the stomach; and Kebesanuf, the falcon-headed spirit who protected the intestines. Each jar was more than a container. It was a magical repository, inscribed with hieroglyphs and invocations. But the heart, the most vital of all, was treated with great caution. In some traditions, it was left in the body, believed to be the seat of intelligence and moral judgment. In others, it was removed, embalmed separately, and returned later. And in rare cases, a heart scarab, a green amulet inscribed with spells from chapter 30b of the Book of the Dead, was placed on the chest if the original heart could not be preserved. This amulet would speak for the deceased at the final judgment, ensuring the heart did not betray them in front of Osiris. The brain, by contrast, was discarded. A hooked tool was inserted through the nostrils to liquefy and remove it, a process that seems brutal by modern standards, but was considered necessary by Egyptian ritual logic. The brain held no spiritual importance in their belief system. It was not needed in the afterlife. Once the internal work was complete, the embalming priests, often referred to as the hearts of Anubis, would begin the wrapping. This was no hurried task. It was ceremonial, often taking up to 15 days, involving hundreds of yards of linen. Each finger and toe was wrapped individually. Each layer of linen was brushed with resin or oil, and in between the wrappings, the priests would insert amulets, dozens, sometimes hundreds, each placed with intent and incantation. The Eye of Horus for protection, the Jed pillar for stability, the scarab beetle for rebirth, the Tayat knot for the blessings of Isis. Each amulet was a magical charge, a divine battery, nestled into the layers like sacred armor. Some wealthier individuals even had golden facial masks placed over the head, most famously seen in the tomb of Tut. Others were adorned with cartonnage, layers of linen or papyrus, soaked in resin and shaped into forms, painted with gods, protective spells, and sacred geometry. As the wrapping continued, priests recited the opening of the mouth prayer, a crucial ceremony meant to awaken the senses of the deceased. Using ritual tools such as the adze, the priest would touch the mouth, eyes, and ears of the wrapped body to restore their ability to eat, see, and hear in the afterlife. Without this, the soul would be trapped in silence and darkness. The final layer of linen was usually pure white, though in some cases decorative bands were painted or embroidered in gold. The body, now transformed into a mummy, was no longer merely a corpse. It was a vessel for eternity, charged with divine essence. And yet, mummification was also a social ritual. For royalty and the wealthy elite, it was an elaborate affair involving multiple embalmers, temple officials, and often entire funerary guilds. These experts worked in sequence, following texts passed down for centuries. They operated under the guidance of high priests, and sometimes even consulted astrologers to choose the ideal burial date. For the less wealthy, the process was simplified. Some could afford only partial embalming, perhaps only the outer wrappings, or just a dried body without a viscera. The poorest citizens often received simple desert burials, relying on the dry heat of the sand to preserve their remains. But even these humble interments were not devoid of belief. Even they were accompanied by prayers, by tokens, by hopes of immortality. What made mummification so powerful in the Egyptian worldview was that it unified the physical and spiritual into one object, a preserved body that became a home for the bar and the oat. If the body was whole, if the rituals were complete, then the journey into the field of reeds, a paradise of eternal abundance, was possible. And so, the final step was not burial, but placement. The mummy was placed inside one or more coffins, often nested like Russian dolls. The innermost coffin cradled the body. The next one bore the painted likeness of the deceased, smiling, serene, eyes wide open. The outer coffin might resemble a shrine, with depictions of protective gods and long spells inscribed around every edge. Then, in a carefully chosen moment, the mummy would be transported, as part of the procession described before, to the tomb. There it would rest among painted walls, surrounded by offerings and texts, sealed away from the world of the living. But to the Egyptians, it was not the end. It was only the beginning. The beginning of eternity, safeguarded by salt and spells, linen and love, wrapped tightly in the arms of myth. There comes a moment in every ancient Egyptian funeral when the hush grows deeper. The procession has ended. The lamentations have quieted. The body has been wrapped, blessed, prepared, adorned. All the rituals have led to this one sacred act, an act as old as the gods themselves. The mourners gather, the air grows heavy with incense and expectation, and before the sealed tomb, something extraordinary is about to unfold. The priest approaches with a tool, simple in form, sacred in purpose. It is the adze. A curved ceremonial blade, often made of stone or bronze, sometimes shaped like the foreleg of a bull. It is not used for cutting. Not anymore. This is no tool of violence. It is a key, a divine instrument, one that opens not just mouths, but portals, that breathes life into death, that gives back what was taken. This is the opening of the mouth ceremony, one of the most mystical and symbolically rich rites in all of Egyptian mortuary tradition. The dead, wrapped in linen, silent in their sarcophagus, are not yet complete. They are preserved, yes, but preservation is not the same as power. The soul may journey, but without this final ritual, the body cannot speak, cannot see, cannot taste, cannot defend itself in the afterlife. The senses are not automatic in eternity. They must be restored. This is what the ancient Egyptians believed, that death silenced the body completely. The eyes saw nothing. The mouth could not speak or eat. The arms and legs were frozen in sacred stillness. The body was no more than a statue. Until this moment, until the priest performed the ancient gestures that mirrored the acts of the gods, they gathered at the tomb. The family, the mourners, the priestly class, even hired ritual performers. The tools were laid out with reverence. The adze, ritual blades, incense burners, ointments, pieces of gold, carved. A calf might be sacrificed, its foreleg used to touch the mummy's mouth, echoing myths of divine power. The tools were symbols, Yes, but they were also magic incarnate. They held the essence of renewal. The priest stepped forward, sometimes dressed as a semprist, bare-chested, with a panther skin over his shoulder. He moved with the gravity of one standing between worlds. Before him lay the mummy, swaddled in fine linen, perhaps adorned with a golden mask or painted face. The eyes were shut, the mouth sealed, the body stiff with ritual. And then the gestures began. The adze touched the lips, lightly, reverently, not to open the flesh, but to open the essence, to unlock the mouth so the soul could speak in the afterlife, to utter spells, to call for food, to recite the names of the gods. In Egyptian belief, speech was power. The ability to speak was the ability to exist. To have no voice was to be erased. And so, this ritual was nothing less than resurrection. The adze moved to the eyes, so the soul could see, not just the physical world, but the spiritual one. To see the gods, to behold the beauty of the field of reeds, to recognize enemies and friends, to gaze upon the book of the dead and its many trials, then to the ears, to hear the prayers, the music, the voice of Osiris, then to the arms, so they might reach, to the legs, so they might walk. Each motion sacred, each touch a rite of power. There were incantations, dozens of them. Some whispered, others sung. Some came from the pyramid texts, others from oral traditions, now lost to time. The words were spells, enchantments, pleas, commands. They called upon Anubis, Osiris, Thoth. They invoked the creative breath of Ra, for clarity, for restoration. These were not metaphors. The ancient Egyptians believed that speaking these words and performing these gestures literally reactivated the senses. Sometimes a statue of the deceased was included in the ritual, especially in royal ceremonies. Two forms were presented, the mummy and the statue, and both were anointed, touched, blessed. This was not redundancy. It was spiritual backup. If one form failed, the other could function in the afterlife, and through all of it, the priest moved with the grace of the divine. This was not theatre. It was sacred reenactment, a microcosm of the original divine act. When Horus restored the powers of his father, Osiris, in myth, Horus found his father lifeless, scattered. Through magic and mourning, through divine will and ritual, he restored Osiris to life. Not in the world of the living, but in the world of the dead. He became king there, and every funeral mirrored this cosmic story. So, when the priest touched the mummy's mouth, he was Horus. When he anointed the limbs, he was Thoth. When he whispered the names of the gods, he was all of them. The human and the divine met at this threshold, a tomb doorway flanked by incense and sacred objects. Sometimes there were dramatic elements. Lamentations were sung in rhythm. Dancers mimed the sorrow of Isis and Neph. Perfumes were poured over the feet of the deceased. Food offerings were brought forth, not to be consumed, but to awaken the senses with their aroma. Bread, beer, meat, figs, dates, the sacred menu of the afterlife. And as these items were presented, the mouth, now opened, could taste again. At least symbolically, the idea was simple, yet profound. You cannot survive in the afterlife if you cannot function. And functioning meant being able to perform the five senses, to see one's surroundings, to hear the voices of gods, to speak spells, to eat food, to walk across the many gates and trials of the duat. In the books of the dead, some spells specifically refer to opening the mouth. These weren't just optional rituals. They were mandatory. Without them, the soul risked becoming mute, blind, powerless, a shadow, and shadows had no peace. They could not join the blessed dead. They could not rest. This fear of becoming voiceless, unseen, haunted the Egyptian worldview. Hence, the elaborate care given to this rite. Even the tools used in the ceremony were sacred. Some were shaped to look like divine symbols. Others bore inscriptions. Some were believed to contain magical essence passed down from generations. In royal tombs, miniature versions of the adze or opening of mouth instruments have been found, perhaps as backups, or perhaps to allow the soul to repeat the ritual itself in eternity. What's most moving, perhaps, is how human this ritual feels. In its core, it is an act of compassion, of continuity, of refusal to let go. The living do not abandon the dead. They restore them. They empower them. They weep, yes, but they also anoint. They also chant. They make sure that when the soul wakes in the next world, it can stand, speak, see, and eat. It is no small thing to love someone enough to make sure they are whole in the afterlife. That is the ultimate farewell. Even today, when we visit tombs, we see traces of this rite. In the images carved into limestone, in the ritual tools left behind, in the placement of offerings. The entire burial site becomes a ritual space, a liminal zone, a place between breath and memory. Sometimes, multiple priests were involved in the ceremony. One for each divine aspect. They might circle the body, they might recite in overlapping voices, they might act out scenes from myth. Every act was layered, every moment saturated with purpose. And when the ritual ended, there was no applause, no celebration, only silence. A sacred silence, the kind that follows true transformation. The body, once still, was now ready, not for this world, but for the next. And that readiness wasn't just spiritual, it was practical. For in the afterlife, the dead had work to do. They had gates to pass, judges to answer, enemies to avoid. They needed their faculties, their voices, their strength. The opening of the mouth gave them that. It was the final gift, one last act of love before sealing the tomb. As the final light of the desert day slipped beneath the horizon and the last gusts of warm wind swept across the sands, the sacred process neared its most solemn moment. The body, now no longer merely human, but divinely prepared, wrapped in linen and cloaked in spells, was ready. The soul had been addressed. The rites had been performed, the myth had been relived, and now, in the quiet gravity of dusk, the journey toward eternity could begin. Burial in ancient Egypt was not a conclusion, but a transition, a liminal crossing from the mortal world to the eternal field of reeds, the field of Ieru, where the soul could live on in abundance, peace, and balance. But just as one would not venture into the desert without provisions, so too did the dead require careful preparation. Every item placed with the body, every word carved on stone, every figure molded by hand, all of it served a singular sacred purpose: to guide, protect, and nourish the soul on its everlasting path. The mummy, now fully wrapped in fine linen, glazed with resin, embedded with amulets and prayers, was placed into a coffin, or in many cases, a series of nested coffins. These were not simple containers. They were spiritual vessels, often painted with images of gods, sacred animals, protective deities, and especially the face of the deceased, stylized and calm. This painted face wasn't merely decorative, it was magical. It allowed the soul to recognize itself in the afterlife. It reminded the divine forces that this person, though no longer breathing, was still an identity, still a name, a face, a story worth remembering. For the wealthy, the outermost coffin might be placed into a grand sarcophagus, stone tomb carved with protective spells, eye symbols, and inscriptions of divine blessings. These slabs of granite or limestone were not just containers. They were fortresses. They guarded the body from desecration, from animals, from decay, but they also served as spiritual barriers, separating the sacred body from the world of chaos, while keeping it forever accessible to the soul, which could come and go in the form of the ba, the winged essence of the spirit. The act of placing the coffin inside the tomb was done with both ceremony and calculation. The tomb was more than a burial place. It was a home for eternity, a house of the dead, architecturally arranged to receive offerings, to channel spiritual forces, and to house the material goods the soul would need. Egyptians called it the House of Eternity. It was built for the long journey ahead. Within this tomb, the most extraordinary part of the burial awaited: the placement of grave goods. To the modern eye, it might look like a collection of ordinary items, but to the ancient Egyptian, it was a life-sized spell, a material manifestation of memory, status, preparation, and love. Near the mummy, attendants carefully arranged jars of food and drink: beer, wine, bread, dried fruits, onions, and roasted meats. These offerings were not symbolic. They were magical sustenance, made real by accompanying spells and by the belief that the soul could consume them in its spiritual form. Some offerings were regularly renewed by living relatives or temple staff, especially for nobles and kings. Others were enchanted to replenish themselves eternally through inscriptions known as offering formulas. In addition to food, tombs were filled with furniture: beds, stools, chairs, headrests, all made of wood or stone, often richly carved and inlaid. There were cosmetics and mirrors, so the deceased could continue the rituals of cleanliness and beauty. There were jewelry boxes filled with amulets, beads, and rings, not just for adornment, but for protection and spiritual significance. One particularly important class of object was the shabdi small, human-shaped figurines crafted from wood, stone, or faience. These little statues were more than decoration. They were servants for the afterlife. The belief was that the soul, upon entering the field of reeds, would be called upon to work, to tend fields, build canals, harvest grain. But a person of wealth or status could avoid such labor by having their shapitis do it for them. Each figure was inscribed with a spell that would awaken it when the soul was called, saying, in essence, "Here I am, I will do it." Some tombs had a handful of others, like those of pharaohs, had hundreds, arranged in miniature armies, complete with overseers and tools. They stood as eternal staff, loyal in death as they had been in life, ready to ensure their master's comfort for all time. Yet all of these physical offerings were made powerful by something less visible, but even more vital. Inscription carved into the walls of the tomb, written on the inside of coffins, or painted on papyrus scrolls rolled and placed near the body, were the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, and later the Book of the Dead. These were not just poems. They were spiritual maps, detailed, powerful, deeply mystical instructions for how the soul should navigate the afterlife, how to avoid traps, how to answer the questions of the gods, how to pass through gates, how to become divine. The pyramid texts, reserved for kings and high elites in the Old Kingdom, were the earliest. They invoked celestial imagery, helping the king ascend to the sky to join the stars and gods. They were chanted aloud by priests and carved into the chambers of pyramids, the ultimate incantation of royal power and eternal light. Later, in the Middle Kingdom, these texts became more accessible, transformed into the coffin texts, written on wooden coffins, and allowing the nobility and wealthy commoners to gain access to the afterlife. Finally, by the New Kingdom, the teachings evolved into what we now call the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and vignettes, often illustrated with beautiful, detailed drawings of the soul's trials. One of the most famous scenes from these texts is the weighing of the heart, a dramatic courtroom in the afterlife. In this imagined space, the soul stood before Osiris, flanked by 42 divine judges. The heart of the deceased, seat of memory and truth, was placed on a scale opposite the feather of Mat, the goddess of justice, balance, and cosmic order. If the heart balanced with the feather, the soul was deemed justified and allowed to enter paradise. If it weighed heavier, burdened with sin, lies, injustice, then it was thrown to Ammit, a devouring beast part crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus. The soul would be annihilated forever. It was not enough to be buried with riches. One had to be righteous, and so the inscriptions included confessions. I have not stolen, I have not killed, I have not lied. These declarations, known as the negative confession, were spiritual testimony aimed at proving one's worth beyond texts. Some tombs included wall paintings, elaborate frescoes that recreated scenes of life, fishing on the Nile, playing music, farming fields. These were not nostalgic images. They were magical recreations, ways to ensure that the soul could continue these joys forever. The act of painting them gave them life in the next world. Even the architecture of the tomb itself was a kind of magic. The walls were aligned with celestial bodies. The shaft leading down to the burial chamber mirrored the path of the sun or stars. The placement of items, the orientation of doorways, the flow of corridors, all were part of a cosmic design meant to harmonize the tomb with the divine. Once everything was in place, the food arranged, the figurines posted, the texts recited, the tomb was sealed, the final moment was sacred. A priest or family member might place a last kiss upon the coffin or scatter incense over the entrance. Then a great stone was rolled into place, sealing the passage. But though the body was now locked away, the Egyptians believed the soul would still return. The tomb remained a place of visitation and veneration. Family members would come to leave offerings, recite prayers, maintain the tomb's structure, Even walls were carved with false doors, symbolic portals through which the soul could pass, return, receive gifts from the living. For kings, massive mortuary temples were constructed nearby, staffed by priests whose only duty was to perform daily rituals for the soul of the deceased. These rites, feeding statues, lighting lamps, singing hymns, were thought to keep the king's spirit alive and powerful in the afterlife. In this way, the tomb became a bridge between the living and the dead, the earthly and the divine. It was both a grave and a gateway, both an ending and a beginning, and in every painted lotus, every carved prayer, every little figurine placed gently by hand, one finds not fear of death, but hope. Hope that love, memory, and faith might triumph. Hope that the journey continues. Hope that the field of reeds awaits. Lush, abundant, eternal. In the heart of ancient Egypt, death was never a solitary ending. It was a mirror reflecting the cosmos. A mirror through which each individual soul became part of something older and larger. A myth that had begun long before they were born. To the Egyptians, funerary rites were not simply ceremonies. They were a retelling of a divine story, a sacred reenactment that tethered the fate of the deceased to the gods themselves. No myth held more power over life and death than that of Osiris, the god who died and lived again. In every tomb, in every procession, in every whisper of incense curling toward the sky, there was Osiris. His shadow fell long across the Nile Valley, not as a fearsome deity, but as a symbol of hope, the very first soul to conquer death and rise again. His story was not only remembered, it was relived, performed in funerals with a solemnity that blurred the line between man and God. The story begins, as many do, with love and betrayal. Osiris was a king, just and beloved, a bringer of civilization, agriculture, and law. But his brother, Set, seethed with envy. Set, the god of chaos and storm, despised the harmony Osiris brought to the world. One day, through deception and cruelty, he tricked Osiris into lying inside an ornate wooden box, a coffin. Once enclosed, Set sealed it shut and hurled it into the Nile, casting his brother into the depths of the underworld. To the Egyptians, this was not myth in the distant sense. It was a ritual cycle, echoed in the river's tides, in the rise and fall of crops, and in the cycles of birth and decay. The murder of Osiris was not a moment in history. It was the universe's first funeral. But the tale did not end there. Isis, Osiris's devoted wife and sister, searched unrelentingly for her husband's body. Through swamps and deserts she wandered. Her tears were said to fill rivers. Her wailing stirred the winds. At last she found him, lifeless, dismembered by Set. With the help of her sister Nephthys and the jackal-headed god Anubis, she pieced him back together, limb by limb, whispering spells older than the stars. Her love, her grief restored him, not to the land of the living, but to eternal life in the realm of the dead. Osiris became the lord of the underworld, the judge of souls. This divine drama, this cycle of death and resurrection, became the template for every Egyptian funeral. Each element of the ritual mirrored a moment in the Osirian myth. The preparation of the body was not just embalming. It was the gathering of Osiris' scattered remains. The mourning of the family echoed the lamentations of Isis and Neph. The opening of the mouth ceremony, where a priest touched the lips of the deceased with ritual tools, was believed to restore the senses. Just as Isis restored Osiris's form, the soul of the dead would not just journey to the afterlife, it would follow in the footsteps of a god. Funerary reenactments of this myth were elaborate affairs. In grand temples and village shrines alike, priests donned sacred costumes. One would take the role of Set, another of Osiris, others of Horus, Anubis, and Thoth. The drama unfolded through chant, gesture, and silence. Some scenes were spoken, others were danced. All were performed with the gravest reverence, for they were not just remembering. They were awakening the cosmic cycle once more. To mourners, watching these rites was not entertainment, but instruction. They saw in Osiris the reflection of their loved one, and in Isis their own grief. Her cries, recited in long wails by temple priestesses, were called the Lamentations of Isis and Nephthys. These were sacred verses, chanted in unison, echoing off tomb walls in haunting tones. Each cry was a prayer, not just of sorrow, but of renewal. For if Osiris could be reborn, so too could the soul of the deceased. In private ceremonies, two women were sometimes appointed to play the roles of Isis and Nephthys. They stood at the head and foot of the coffin, arms raised in stylized grief, their hair undone, a sign of mourning. They were not acting, they were becoming. Their presence turned the tomb into a theatre of the divine. In their voices, the myth came alive. These rites were not static, they evolved over centuries. In the Old Kingdom, they were performed primarily by the priesthood. By the New Kingdom, aspects of the rituals were personalized, adapted to the social class, wealth, and regional customs of the deceased. But always, Osiris remained at the center. Even commoners were buried with small figurines or painted scrolls showing scenes of the Osirian myth. The story was democratized, not diminished. It became the passport to eternity. Magic, myth, and ritual were inseparable in Egypt. They were the language through which life was understood. And so too was death. Reenactment, to them, was not mere symbolism. It was activation. To perform the myth was to make it real. And so, funerals were timed with care. Certain rites were performed at night, when the sun, the symbol of Ra, traveled through the underworld. Others were held at dawn, when light returned and rebirth was possible. The alignment of the stars, the phase of the moon, even the direction of incense smoke, all carried meaning. Everything was part of the divine story. Even the layout of the tomb reflected the mythic vision. The burial chamber symbolized the womb of the sky goddess Nut, a place where death became gestation. The coffin was not a container, but a cocoon. Its inscriptions called upon Osiris, invoking his name dozens, sometimes hundreds of times. These were not just prayers. They were contracts, agreements with the divine, and for the living, the myth of Osiris offered comfort. It said, "Death is not chaos. Death is not the end. Death is a story, and you are not alone in it. You walk a path carved by gods, tended by ancestors, and protected by spells. This is why, even in the smallest village, even for the humblest laborer, funerals were sacred performances. A man might die nameless to history, but his rites linked him to a cosmic destiny. His soul, like Osiris, would journey through darkness, face judgment, and if found righteous, be reborn. In this way, the myth became memory, and memory became ritual. Over generations, the story of Osiris was painted on tomb walls, whispered in mourning songs, etched into the minds of children watching their elders grieve. It was not forgotten, because it was never left behind. It lived again and again, with every passing. And so when you enter an Egyptian tomb, real or imagined, look beyond the stone and silence, see the echoes of reenactment. The priest raising the ceremonial tool, the mourner's cry in the voice of a goddess, the carved relief of a soul standing before Osiris's throne. They were not performing a play. They were stitching the soul of the departed into the fabric of eternity. Because in Egypt, myth was not a story. It was salvation. The moment a loved one passed from this world into the next, the living were left with more than silence. In ancient Egypt, the space between life and death was never a barrier, but a threshold, one that had to be honored, guarded, and fed. Death was not abandonment. It was a transformation. And for those left behind, mourning became a sacred responsibility. A task that did not end with burial, but echoed across days, seasons, even generations. In the soft morning light, families would gather, their feet pressing into sand still cool from the desert night, their voices hushed. They carried baskets filled with bread and beer, fruits and meats, oils and sweet water. But this was no ordinary meal. This was a banquet for the dead. Outside the tomb, in the courtyard carved into stone or nestled beneath the open sky, they would set a table not just for themselves, but for the soul of the one they had lost. These funerary banquets, feasts of remembrance, were both solemn and celebratory. The living would share food and stories, laughter and tears, believing deeply that the deceased was present, that the ka, the vital essence of the departed, could partake of the food's spirit, even if not its substance. To eat was to remember. To remember was to sustain. Mourning in Egypt was never a quiet sorrow. It was public, poetic, and often prolonged wails echoed down village alleys. Women unbound their hair in grief, a powerful gesture of emotional rawness. They beat their chests, smeared ash on their faces, and sang lamentations, sacred songs passed down like heirlooms. These were not outbursts of despair, but ritual expressions, guided by tradition, measured in rhythm. Tears became libations. Grief became offering. For the wealthy, mourning was amplified. Entire households wore linen dyed dull with mourning hues. Hired mourners, often women trained in the performance of grief, led processions of sorrow. Their cries pierced the air, their movements choreographed like ancient theatre. They were the professional voice of sadness, giving shape to the ache of those too stunned to speak. But mourning was more than display. It had purpose. It fed the dead. It kept them connected. The soul of the deceased was not a single entity. The Egyptians believed in multiple aspects, chief among them the ka and the ba. The ka was the vital force, the life spark that needed nourishment. The ba, on the other hand, was the personality, the spirit that could move between the worlds. Capable of flight, emotion, and memory, that was the ka that required offerings. And so, families would continue to visit tombs long after burial. Not once, but regularly. Monthly, seasonally, on anniversaries and holy days. They would bring fresh bread and beer, pour wine onto the earth, and speak the names of their ancestors aloud, for to speak a name was to keep it alive. Some families would build small chapels attached to the tomb, with stone offering tables and niches for incense. These spaces became portals, places where the boundary between living and dead blurred. It was there, they believed, that the car might emerge, invisible but present, to receive the essence of what was given. But not every family could visit so often, and so some hired co-priests, temple servants, whose sole duty was to perform these rituals on behalf of the family. These priests lived near necropolises and moved from tomb to tomb, offering prayers, lighting lamps, reciting spells, and ensuring that no soul went hungry. In return, they were paid in food, goods, or land, a sacred economy built around the afterlife. Over time, many families established endowments, a kind of spiritual pension to fund these priests indefinitely. Contracts were drawn up, details recorded on papyrus. So long as the sun rises. One contract read, "You shall offer beer to my car, and bread to my mouth." Even in death, Egyptians understood the need for dependable service. But it wasn't all ritual. There was love in this maintenance. A son returning year after year to sweep dust from a father's tomb. A daughter pressing her cheek to the cold stone wall of her mother's burial chamber. These were acts of devotion, acts of remembrance that surpassed grief and entered into sacred duty. Inside the tombs themselves, inscriptions called out to the living, words chiseled with care. Some read, "O passerby, do not forget me." Others pleaded, "Say my name and offer a jar of beer." These were not metaphors. They were instructions, magical requests, binding in the afterlife. The dead needed the living, and the living found meaning in serving the dead. And yet, the interaction did not move in only one direction. The bar, the spirit, was believed to remain active, to fly from the tomb like a bird at dawn, flitting through the villages, drifting into the dreams of loved ones. People believed the dead could intervene, bringing messages, warnings, or protection. A mother might feel the warm hand of her late husband in a moment of despair. A farmer might dream of his father and wake with insight into where to plant the new crop. There were even letters to the dead, actual texts written by surviving relatives and placed in tombs or left at shrines. These letters requested favors, protection, intercession with the gods. One surviving papyrus reads, "O my brother, why do you not help me in court? You promised to watch over me." Another pleads, "Intercede on my behalf before the divine tribunal, that my enemies may not prevail." In this, death was not a vanishing. It was a relationship, ongoing, evolving, and deeply felt. Entire cemeteries became communities. Tombs were neighbors. Families would return and camp near burial sites during festivals like the Feast of the Valley, where the city of the living would pour across the river to embrace the city of the dead. They would bring music, food, laughter. Children would run among the stones, learning the names of ancestors as if they were still present. Stories were passed down. Connections renewed. To the Egyptians, memory was a form of sustenance. Forgetting was a kind of death, more final than burial. Tombs were designed with this in mind. Many included false doors, carved panels through which the car could pass to receive offerings. Walls were painted with scenes of eternal feasts, farming, games, and music. Not just decoration, these images were magical blueprints for the afterlife. They gave the soul something to return to, a life to rejoin, a scene to step into. For the poorest Egyptians, who could not afford tombs or priests, remembrance came in simpler forms, a scrap of linen tied to a tree, a name spoken at sunset, a bowl of water left on a household altar. But no act was too small. Every gesture mattered. Every memory carried weight. Some families placed Shabti dolls in tombs, small figurines, meant to serve the deceased in the afterlife. These were inscribed with spells, commanding them to work on behalf of the dead when called upon, even in death. Egyptians imagined labor, but they also imagined help, companionship, continuity. The desire to remain connected went beyond ritual. It was architectural. Cities were built with cemeteries at their edges, never far from sight. The Nile itself became a symbol of this passage, flowing both through the land and through memory. The west bank of the river, where the sun set, was the domain of the dead. The east, where the sun rose, was for the living. But the boat, crossing back and forth, joined them. In every way, mourning was more than pain. It was a practice, a dialogue, a bridge. Over centuries, as dynasties rose and fell, beliefs adapted, but the essential truth remained. Death was not a silence to be feared. It was a new kind of presence to be honored. And so the living tended to the dead, not just at the time of passing, but in every season that followed, in every bite of bread left on a stone altar, in every whispered name, in every letter written to the one who no longer answered in voice, but answered in signs. Because the Egyptians knew what we are only beginning to remember, that love does not end with breath, it transforms. And in that transformation, the soul lives on, not only in eternity, but in us. In ancient Egypt, the afterlife was the great equalizer eventually, but in the meantime, your earthly paycheck determined just how fancy your transition to eternity would be. After all, dying was serious business, especially if you were a pharaoh with a nation-sized budget and an ego to match the Nile. If you had the resources, your funeral could be less about bidding farewell to the world and more about leaving behind a small architectural wonder people would be arguing about for millennia. Let's start at the top, the very top. Pharaohs, the god-kings, the living Horus. These gentlemen didn't just die, they transitioned into a new cosmic role with fanfare that would make modern state funerals look like school picnics. From the moment a pharaoh drew his last breath, if not long before his journey to the next world, was choreographed like an eternal Broadway production. Except with more incense, gold leaf, and jackal-headed gods. First came the tomb. Not just any tomb, a pyramid if you were early enough in Egyptian history, and if you were really lucky, a nice neighborhood spot at Giza with a view of the Sphinx. Later, mortuary temples and rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings took over cozier, less conspicuous options, because even pharaohs eventually got tired of grave robbers and pyramid maintenance bills. These royal tombs were no small feat. They weren't just burial chambers, they were metaphysical launch pads, designed with astronomical precision, decorated with spells, myths, and night skies to guide the departed soul through the treacherous terrain of the Duet the Egyptian underworld. If you've ever wondered what it's like to prep for death like a video game quest, this was it. The pharaoh had to battle serpents, answer riddles, sail across lakes of fire, and show up looking good while doing it. The art on those tomb walls was not just decoration, it was a literal travel guide to the afterlife, complete with maps and magical passwords. And of course, the grave goods. Pharaohs didn't believe in packing light. Chariots, beds, thrones, cosmetics, board games, even a few jars of honey in case the underworld had a poor snack selection. Not to mention Shabti Dolstein servant figurines made of wood or faience, pre-programmed via spell to do chores for you in the next world. Why do your own celestial laundry when you can outsource it eternally? Then there was the mummification. You haven't been pampered until you've had your organs individually embalmed. Your body soaked in natron for 40 days, your limbs wrapped, with hundreds of yards of linen each layer whispered over with prayers and protection spells. Royals got custom amulets tucked into the fold scarabs, jed pillars, the eye of Horosol aimed at keeping your soul intact, your body recognizable, and your odds in the afterlife firmly stacked. But, of course, not everyone could be a pharaoh. Some people were born without gold-plated sarcophagi or personal pyramid architects. For the vast majority of Egyptians, scribes, farmers, potters, brewers, bakers, and the like death came just as surely, but with considerably fewer architectural blueprints. The average Egyptian burial was less grandeur, more practicality. If you were lucky, your family could scrape together enough for a decent wooden coffin maybe, even painted to look like your idealized younger self and a place in the family tomb. If not, a simple hole in the sand might have to do. The desert was dry, and that worked in nature's favor. Shallow graves often preserved bodies through natural mummification. No natron required, just the heat and time. But even the humblest graves weren't empty. They'd contain the essentials: a ceramic pot or two, some bread, perhaps a jug of beer, or a favorite tool. The thinking was consistent. You were going somewhere, and you'd need supplies. Even in poverty, the dead were sent off with whatever dignity the living could muster. Some commoners did manage to afford mummification, though it was a budget version of the royal spa treatment. Maybe you couldn't afford gold-plated toe caps or gemstone amulets, but you could still be dried out and wrapped up decently enough. It all depended on your social class and connections. Egyptian death, like Egyptian life, ran on a sliding scale of privilege. Now, there were mass graves too. Don't let the poetic imagery fool you. Not every soul got a tomb. During famines, plagues, or wars, bodies were sometimes buried en masse, unmarked, unadorned, a grim necessity. But even then, there was often someone, a family member, a neighbor who whispered a prayer, left a flower, or spoke the name of the deceased aloud, because names had power, and to be remembered was to live on. That was the beauty of Egyptian belief. The trappings varied, but the goal remained the same: preserve the soul, honor the dead, and keep the link between the worlds alive. Pharaoh, or potter, tomb, or sandpit, the afterlife awaited all. Still, one cannot help but marvel at the contrast. A pharaoh dies, and suddenly 1,000 workers are carving spells into granite. There are entire teams designing ceremonial beds, guards lining up with incense, and embalmers working round the clock like an ancient luxury spa. The state budget creaks. Temples adjust their calendars. Priests begin reciting Book of the Dead passages like a liturgical podcast that runs for weeks. Meanwhile, in the village nearby, old Senab, the basket weaver, slips away quietly in his sleep. His family washes his body, wraps him in plain linen, and buries him in the sand at dawn with a loaf of barley bread and a prayer. There is no Book of the Dead, but someone knows a spell or two. Someone speaks his name. And in that moment, both pharaoh and weaver begin the same mysterious journey. The irony, of course, is that many of those grand royal tombs were looted within a generation. Gold disappeared. Mummies were tossed aside or repurposed. Grave robbers didn't discriminate. A sarcophagus was a sarcophagus, and yet many simple desert graves remained untouched, protected not by guards or spells, but by obscurity and the shifting sands. There's something oddly comforting about that. That in the long run, all the gold in Egypt couldn't guarantee more peace than a patch of quiet desert and the love of a family who remembered you. And let's talk about pyramid envy. Oh yes, even in death, the Egyptians had social climbers. Middle-ranking officials tried to copy royal styles on a budget. Mini pyramids, sarcophagi that looked suspiciously like pharaohs, just smaller and slightly crooked. You can barely tell the difference in dim light. They probably said. Tomb inscriptions often featured job titles in big letters: overseer of the granaries, royal scribe of the left-hand inventory, as if bureaucracy had a VIP lounge in the afterlife. Yet, for all the effort, the theology didn't demand luxury, the spells, the rituals, the heart-weighing scene before Osiris. Those worked just as well for someone buried with a painted pot as someone buried with a gold chariot. What mattered was purity, remembrance, and preparation. The rest was embellishment. Expensive, breathtaking embellishment, but embellishment nonetheless. And then there were the tomb builders themselves, skilled workers who carved the tombs of kings by day and quietly dug their own modest graves by night. Entire villages, like Deir el-Medina, were filled with artisans whose lives were devoted to preparing the dead for eternity. Ironically, they often ended up better preserved than the kings they worked for. Their tombs, nestled into the cliffs, were personal, elegant, and heartfelt. Scenes of family life, fishing, music. They painted what they loved, not what they feared. Their belief wasn't based on gold or granite, but on the conviction that life continued, that you'd rise each morning in the field of reeds and do what you loved without aches, taxes, or grain shortages. For some, paradise was a field of flowers. For others, it was sitting with family, drinking beer beneath a fig tree. Egyptian heaven was deeply personal and beautifully human. The idea that everyone, regardless of class, had a BA and KA soul and essence that deserved care was radical. In a world where most societies reserved spiritual aftercare for elites, Egypt stood apart. Yes, wealth shaped the experience, but the fundamentals applied to all. The smallest grave could contain the largest hope. Even animals got the royal treatment sometimes. Cats, hawks, ibises mummified and buried with reverence. Some pets were even buried, with their owners nestled at their feet, their own tiny amulets tucked in their linen. Egyptians didn't just worship animals, they loved them. If you were particularly attached to your cat, there was a decent chance you'd meet again beyond the veil, possibly with divine status. Ultimately, the story of Egyptian burial practices is not one of inequality, it's one of creativity. Each class found its way to honor the dead, some with stone and gold, others with bread and memory, and through it all, a shared belief that death was not an end, but a homecoming. Pharaohs may have built pyramids to touch the stars, but it was the whispered prayers of farmers, the songs of widows, and the dusty offerings left by grandchildren that truly bridged the world's dot. Because, no matter how elaborate the tomb, how grand the sarcophagus, the thing that mattered most always was being remembered. And in that, the pharaoh and the potter stood side by side. In the golden silence of the Egyptian twilight, where the last rays of the sun melt into the ochre sands, and the Nile breathes in slow rhythms, one can still feel it, the echo of eternity. Somewhere in the vast hush of time, amidst the broken statues and faded hieroglyphs, an old truth still stirs, that for the ancient Egyptians, death was never the end. It was a passage, a portal, a carefully orchestrated journey, mapped with symbols, guarded by gods, paved with rituals. They called it the beautiful West, the place beyond the setting sun, where the soul would voyage to live again. But before that, there was much to do. There were rites to be performed, bodies to be prepared, tears to be shed, and spells to be whispered across linen and stone. Death, to them, was no quiet slipping away. It was a dance, an eternal dance, choreographed by the cosmos and performed by every soul who ever lived. The rituals we've explored, so strange, so beautiful, were never arbitrary. They were precise, ancient codes carved into the bedrock of Egyptian civilization. Every act, every gesture, every object laid in the tomb was part of a larger story, a sacred narrative that wove together the worlds of the living and the dead, a dance that began with the final breath and extended far beyond the grave, and it always began with the soul's departure. The heart stopped, the body stilled, and yet this was only the first step. The living sprang into action. Embalmers, priests, mourners, family, each played their role in a ritual centuries in the making. The body, now the vessel of the eternal, was bathed and purified, dried in natron, and wrapped in linen. The soul needed the body, or at least its image, to recognize itself in the next world. Preservation was not vanity, it was survival. Amid those linen folds, they slipped in amulets and charms, not as decoration, but as protection, symbols that sang to the divine. A scarab over the heart to plead before Osiris, an eye of Horus to ward off evil, a jed pillar for strength. These were the keys, the passwords, the sacred security system of the afterlife. One did not simply wander into paradise unarmed. You went prepared, then came the journey, not just across land and river, though that too. The body was carried in procession, the streets alive with song and wailing, flutes and sistrums, chants of lament and praise. Isis and Nephthys, played by priestesses, wept before the bier, reenacting the divine sorrow. The Nile was crossed, a boat, the symbol of eternal passage, bore the mummy from the land of the living to the threshold of the dead. And always, always, the eyes of the people watched, for this was more than ceremony. It was the reenactment of cosmic balance, of Mat. Tombs were prepared like miniature universes, carved with the stars, painted with stories, stocked with goods, food, tools, games, even letters. Because one does not travel into the next world unaccompanied. You needed everything from shabty servants to sandals, from makeup to meat. These tombs were memory machines, designed to hold the identity of the soul forever. But perhaps the most haunting beauty of it all was the myth behind the ritual. Osiris, king of the dead, killed by his jealous brother, Set, torn into pieces, reassembled by his grieving wife Isis, who, through magic and love, conceived a son, Horus. This cycle, death, mourning, rebirth, became the backbone of Egyptian funerary rites. Every death was Osiris, every mourner, Isis, every tomb, a chance at resurrection. It was not just mythology, it was psychology, theology, a way to make meaning from the unbearable. They were telling themselves, and each other, that loss was not loss, that endings were beginnings, that the dead were not gone, only gone ahead. This belief was universal, from the opulent tombs of pharaohs to the shallow graves of farmers, all shared in the dream. Some had gold masks, others had clay pots, but all had hope, and hope, in Egypt, was eternal. Even in the way they spoke of death, one hears it. They didn't say someone had died, they said they had gone to the west. Or they had joined the ancestors. They didn't mourn as if the person were lost. They prepared them, fed them, spoke to them. The tomb was not a prison, it was a portal. And the dead were not silent. They listened, they watched, they cared. Offerings continued long after the burial. Meals placed by the tomb, prayers recited, names spoken, because the greatest death was to be forgotten. And the Egyptians, wise and weary in the ways of eternity, made sure no soul was ever erased. It's ironic, really, that a culture so obsessed with death was, in many ways, more alive than any other. They were intimate with the end, not fearful, but respectful. Death wasn't a taboo, it was a teacher, and through it they built a civilization that looked beyond the veil, and saw, not darkness, but light. Think of it, they built pyramids not to dazzle us, but to guide their kings through the stars. They wrote books not for entertainment, but as manuals for the soul. They made art not for vanity, but to echo the eternal. Every line, every glyph, every color, a map to something greater, and that is perhaps the most beautiful paradox of all. The more they prepared for death, the more they seemed to love life. They painted gardens, banquets, music. They believed in love beyond the grave, in friendship that continued across worlds. They feared the loss of laughter more than the loss of breath. They left behind not just tombs, but testimonies that life, in all its richness, mattered, that what we eat, how we love, what we build, all of it echoed in eternity. Even the poorest Egyptian was promised this, maybe not a pyramid, but a place in the field of reeds, a mirror world of earth only perfect. Crops grew without toil, water flowed without end. There the soul could walk again in youth, in joy, in peace, and not alone. Reunited with family, with friends, with pets, even with the gods. It is a vision so tender, so human, that one almost forgets the time and distance between us. These people, who lived so long ago, worried about the same things we do. Will we be remembered? Will we be loved? Will our lives mean something? And in their answer, their rituals, their myths, their eternal dance, we find comfort. Because they believed the soul was not a flicker, but a flame. That it did not end, but transformed. That grief was not the closing of a door, but the opening of a passage. So, as we end this long, winding journey through ancient Egyptian funerary customs, we are left not with sorrow, but with awe, with gratitude, with a strange, gentle peace, for in their strange rituals, their chants and carvings, their silent tombs and golden masks, we find something achingly familiar, a desire to remember, a refusal to forget, a belief that love, real love, survives death. Perhaps that is what makes their story so enduring. Not the pyramids, not the mummies, but the heart that beats beneath it all. A heart wrapped in linen, buried in sand, carried on prayers, and yet, somehow, still speaking, whispering. Across time, I lived, I mattered, I am not gone, and in listening, in telling their story, we join the dance.